So your specialty is Ottoman history. And it's now over 100 years since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, right. Ottoman Khilafah.
Yeah.
What, in your estimation, and the way that we've seen the past century progress or otherwise, but let's, how the 100 years have transpired, including the 2 world wars, including numerous conflicts and wars around the world, how do you see the loss to the world that was left behind as a result of the fall of the Ottoman Khilafah?
I think for the region, it's been catastrophic, fundamentally. I've said this before and I'll say it again, that the sort of like British and the Americans replacing the Khilafah as the nominal Khilafah, if you want to call it that, in terms of the states that emerge from it are subservient to the United States. So they are actually the replacement of the Ottomans. That type of hierarchical authority hasn't left. And what they've done is they've been a lot more detrimental in terms of what they've done to the region. I mean, they've been, people get upset when I say this who are my colleagues in America, but they've been more savage than the Mongols and the Crusaders combined. Now, what the interesting thing is they've created an imagination, perhaps, which is that without them, the region will go into further chaos. So we're in this sort of like paradox of rock and hard place. And so, and if we were to speak about Gaza right now, the idea of the possibility of the Israeli project collapsing in and of itself is scary for the region, because if that project fails, it puts a spotlight on their own projects in regards to the nation states that were created with crayons by Sykes and Picot. The Israeli project was fundamentally ideologically driven in some ways. So they have far more of an investment in terms of trying to safeguard that project. But the rest of the projects were given to them in some shape or form, right? So in that sense, what we're seeing is a manifestation of the absence in a way in which Islam civilizationally is absent on the discussion table for humanity. In that sense, there's an absence of a possibility of showing an alternative to humanity at a time where we can clearly see that the alternative in regards to discussion is necessary, is missing. So even in this part of the world, when we complain about, some of us anyway, that American hegemony needs to sort of extract itself from the region so that the region can have some time to breathe, the naysayers turn around and say, well, would you want Russia or China? And that's not the argument we're making here. What the argument we're making is that we want the Ummah to have some breathing space to try to fashion something that indigenously comes from their own repository, which is something they had in the past. And that hasn't gone, actually. That memory is still there. The fact that the unique thing about Muslims and Islam, I would argue, is that in our culture, we are generational. We hand down knowledge generationally. And that's the unique thing about human beings in general. But Islam specifically has a particular style of passing on knowledge generationally, which is the idea of haqq. And so here in the region, you can still feel it amongst the regular folk, that they want a particular sense of justice and goodness in their politics. That is something which they've experienced maybe from their historical past. And those memories have been passed down, even though the contemporary generation have never experienced that, perhaps. But it's a memory that's continuously given to them from the ulama, from the books they read, from the buildings they see, to the food they eat. Islam is infused in it. So they're aware of that from osmosis, perhaps.
I'm going to come back to the Ottoman times and the kind of description of that. But let me ask you about something you mentioned a little bit earlier, about how the West, through the empirical powers, whether it be the turn of the century through the Brits and the French, or whether it be towards the latter part through the Americans, were practiced more savagery than the Mughals and put together. Was that by design? Or was that something that just happened simply because it's a natural progress of powers? That's how they evolve. That's how they become.
I'm reluctant to say that that's how they become. I mean, fundamentally, a very Western-centric way of looking at power is that all power is just savage. But that's not how Muslims look at power. Muslims see power as a neutral form, perhaps. The idea that it's about managing the affairs of people. Now, people do make mistakes, but in our tapestry of Islam, when we see the long jury of how Islam has manifested, yes, there's been moments of violence both from us and against us, but not to this level. This level is something that is more indigenous to the sort of culture that is coming from the West, which is the absolute disregard for Allah Ta'ala's existence as a way of him holding them to account. And that absence of that idea permits human beings to be a lot more savage to each other, because there's no accountability emotionally and intellectually, perhaps. And that's the essence of what human beings are. They require that. So to intellectually dislocate yourself from that idea, but it's also from your fitrah that you dislocate yourself in that way, it can lead to nothing but degeneracy, right? You've sort of like deconstructed what it means to be human. And the goodness that exists in insan from its offset has been lost, either by design or by accident. But nonetheless, that idea of not having accountability from the one who's created you is going to lead to a far greater form of violence than if you had accountability on your shoulders. Even if we had madmen throughout, this is the term people use, and I'm reluctant to use that term actually, but even if we had leaders, military men, and so forth go off script a little bit, fundamentally the Ummah and Islam and the ulama would bring them back to a particular center. So it wasn't consistent. It wasn't systematic, is what I'm saying. And this is something we can see throughout the history of Islam. Now, do we need, and to your point about a probably more mature conversation about violence, perhaps? Because sometimes people don't appreciate that insan is a violent creature. And wars are going to happen, and people are going to fight each other, and there's going to be differences, and they can lead to calamities. Yes, I think that's why history becomes important, where you can teach people the nature of human beings and why these things happen. But I don't believe, I fundamentally believe, like I'll give you an example of a strange theory. Muslims have always written about cyclical theories, right? And one of the interesting things about these cyclical theories, whether people believe in them or not, is the idea that, and every nation has their time. So you go through a particular cycle, and then you go through a possibility of a decline moment or just a combustion moment. It's not sustainable. Now, in modernity, you remove that decline possibility because you're in a continuous state of progress. So there is no decline anymore. There's no possibility of even imagining decline. So as you're continuously progressing upwards, what happens is, it's not that decline is not happening. Is that you're unable to see the decline because you rejected the idea. Now, some of us who are Muslim, perhaps, and who are Allah-centered, we're looking at the United States of America and Israel and saying, it's not working, something's going wrong here. And this is following a particular reoccurrence of what empires in the past have shown. And this is no different in that sense. Now, what they will say is we are different. The idea of being modern, the idea of progress has set us apart from humanity from the beginning of time. But as a Muslim, I can't accept that fact. I'll say, no, that's actually problematic for me. And when I'm looking at Israel and the United States of America as an empire, I'm positing the possibility that they're in trouble. Now, how long that will take, Allah knows best, because time is a variable that we can't measure, right? But what I would say to anyone who was in the region, perhaps, is that is a calculation that they must take into consideration. Now, how long that will be, I don't know. But the problem is that we, as well as Malik bin Nabi says, we've come under the yoke of being colonizable, right? And so as a result of that, we are unable to imagine the possibility of a future beyond the now. And so I say that what happens with modernity is it removes the possibility of imagining the future. You have a continued present. It's just the now and the next day and the next day. And so policymakers in the region, one, don't adhere to what Islam tells them regarding policy, which they should have embraced. And two, the possibility that the framework which they belong to, which they will say is a pragmatic position, but I would say it's not. It's a position which is foolhardy in the sense that they're not anticipating the possibilities of what could happen, and they're not driven, and this is where Islam is important, because the notion of nubuwwah, prophecy, is to influence, to make a better future, right? And we do that in everyday life. I'm going to get married by this time. I'm going to finish my PhD by this time. I'm going to travel. You are future oriented. So on this matter itself, why have we moved away from that is a little bit concerning for me. And that's an intellectual position. And I can see that that's what it's created is an intellectual collective deficit, especially in leadership. And there are many reasons for that, as you know.
Let's go back to to Ottoman times. If I was to ask you about the main contributions of the Ottomans to global affairs, as the globe was known back then, in whatever sphere, what would it be?
The Ottomans put Islam as a civilization back on the table. I mean, I think sometimes people forget the savagery of the Mongol and Crusader world, the sort of like worldview that they had constructed. Now, we have a particular inferiority complex as Muslims in the sense that we feel the need to continuously highlight the negativity of what the Ottomans have done as a way of creating parity. And I understand that. It's not like the Ottomans were perfect. But what they take off the table as a result of that, as a consequence of that, is 600 years of civilizational discourse, 600 years of confessional communities living side by side, 600 years of science, maths, tech, 600 years of Islamic scholarship, and 600 years of, as I said, generationally allowing Islam to be passed on over and over. We're still Muslim here today because of that. And that is something that, if it was a 600-year empire of continual or constant violence in the way that we're seeing the world today, I mean, you create tremendous ruptures. And that's not what the Ottomans were doing. Now, was the world violent at the time? Of course it was. It was post-Mongol in that sense. But they bring to the table an attempt to internalize this sort of like post-Mongol, post-Seljuk, Mamluk, Byzantine, Eastern Roman world, and then put a canopy over it, and then put Islam's stamp on that. And they were a reflection of their time. And the idea that you can continuously reinvent yourself over a 600-year stretch is phenomenal. And how does that happen, right? And so they must have been doing something right in that sense. And we're here in Istanbul right now. You look at the Suleymaniye, you look at Fatih Jami, you look at Ayub and so forth. You look at these structures and buildings, and you have to ask yourself, okay, what's going on here, right? This can't be just smash and grab. This is civilizational, and you can see it in the artwork. You can see it in the calligraphy. Islam was the center in the way that they saw the world. For that reason, I always complain about this 600-year collective amnesia, perhaps, it hurts us because it dislocates us from Islam itself. The idea that for 600 years, Islam had nothing to offer in our imagination is problematic.
Could that not be said also of Andalusia?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Andalusia is exceptionally unique in terms of what it achieved. I mean, how many people... Part of European identity, which is really unique, is they create their identity by not being the other, right? So they don't say, I'm English. They'll say, I'm not German, right? It's that way of constructing that identity first. The second thing was the separation of church and state. And the third thing was the concern they had regarding Islam in regards to Andalusia and the Ottoman Empire. And when we have the history of Andalusia, once again, you will know and I know that the history of Andalusia is a violent one, is a bloody one, and so forth. But nonetheless, when you go to the Alhambra, when you go to Cordoba, when you go to Toledo, and you look around and you say, wait, this is civilization. And the Spanish have not replicated anything like it in that sense. And then you realize that, okay, they were bringing something to the table. Now, I do make the argument that we shouldn't continuously celebrate scientific achievements. I think that's a response to modernity in the fact that the Western world presents itself as scientifically superior than everyone else.
Right. So we try to contend and say, well,
absolutely,
we built that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't think Muslims historically have ever had that complex. They have just borrowed from every civilization and then chosen to make it better. That was the way they operated. They took something. Sometimes they invented things. Sometimes they saw someone else invent it, but they just brought it into the fold of Islam and said, how can this benefit the community? That's it. That's just the way they looked at it. And so when you see across the board, Islam is a wonderful civilizational builder in the sense that it goes into a space, it builds on that civilization, and it attempts not to destroy. And as a result of that, because that's a human endeavor, there are at times erroneous ideas that remain in societies. But that gives you an indication that Islam was not barbaric in that sense, and the Muslims were aware of that. And then they did wonderful things. And Andalusia is a wonderful example of that. And the loss of Andalusia and that particular violence against Andalusia is a particular moment also that indicates the ability of Western violence, because then you see the extension of the transatlantic slave trade, India, and so forth, and then the Ottoman Empire, and now we see what has happened right now. So there is a particular genealogy that takes place in that sense, and Andalusia could be seen as the beginning of that type of violence towards Muslims, perhaps.
And I mean, just to confirm what you just said regarding the contribution of the Ottomans, the fact that you still travel through swathes of land in Central Asia, the Arab world, I mean, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, and even down to Yemen and the like, and you see the whether it be the architecture, whether it be the language, whether it be the dress code, or whether rather than as we recognize civilizations that came and went as pillagers, as destructors, as grabbers of resource and land and the such, they built,
Absolutely.
they constructed,
Absolutely.
they contributed to people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, the mistake that people make, and this is maybe part of the construction of the nationalist discourse, is to say, look at Istanbul in comparison to. And you say, wait, that's a capital city. It's the center of power. It's always going to be a lot more lavish in comparison to. But what the Ottomans did for centuries in the rest of their domains is they allowed local peoples to govern locally, actually. There's no way that you can keep the boot on the neck for 600 years. It's impossible. You would have seen multiple revolts and rebellions like we've seen against the Americans. That hasn't happened in the Ottoman world. That tells you something, that the Ottomans were pretty skilled in the way that they operated regarding negotiation. And the way that they negotiated with locals, and often it was local governors and local leaderships and local peoples who were upkeeping. It's a modern phenomena, for example, that power does everything for you. Like, we ask the state for electricity, for water, and so that never happened prior to the modern period. People were running things themselves, and so the state wouldn't need, or the government at that time wouldn't need to do these things for them. It was self-sustaining, and I think that's important. And I think this point for me is really important in regards to the way Muslims operate in our own institutions, which is institutionalization to some degree in the Western context takes away the communal capacity to feel responsible of that institution, right? And so they leave it to the rules and the regulations and the person at the top. Whereas in the Islamic world, up until the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and this is every Muslim sort of like power did this, is they allowed a level of self-sustenance for the ummah to sustain themselves. And so they felt responsible for their own everyday matters in terms of what they were doing, from the upkeeps of the masajids to the waqfs to even going on warfare and so on. And I think the problem is that when we're looking at history, we're only looking at leadership. And I say generally that the historians that used to write about Islam before, fundamentally they were interested in three things: power, ilm, and ummah, right? And you can categorize as you can say like khilafah, ulama, and the ummah. And these are three institutions in Islam, human institutions, you can say, that would be regulated by Islam and then had the responsibility within this hierarchy of, wouldn't even be a hierarchy, the relationship would be reciprocal to some degree, of running the affairs of everyday life, right? And that's how it operated, which people can't see today because the modern state is a very different type of machinery in terms of the relationship with power. But in the Ottoman Empire, you'll see continuously sultans being removed from power. So they weren't as despotic as people make it out to be. And that term itself was created by Weber, right? The Oriental despot, sultanism, and so forth. The idea that the sultan was this Eastern despot in comparison to the ideas of what communism is trying to propose, perhaps. But the sultan, the idea of sultan is somebody who's a deputy. Yeah, and Muslims understood that. Now, the reason why they had a sultanate sort of like criterion perhaps at that time is because for them that was the best culture of longevity, of passing on power and maintaining the status quo. So it came out of a particular necessity, and then it became the status quo, and then people were nervous about making that adjustment.
We talked today in various contexts about the diversity being a challenge, in as much as it could be with wise administration an asset. The very short-lived concept of multiculturalism in the UK, for instance, which is now being fought tooth and nail by the far right and the like, And one wonders, with the swathes of area that the Ottomans controlled, all the way to northern India, to, the very tips of Eastern Africa, and even, areas in Eastern Europe and the like. With all those minorities, all those ethnicities, the faiths, the religions, the sects, how on earth did they govern all those? I mean, you mentioned the issue of decentralized governance, but it goes beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what I mean. I mean, firstly, what's interesting is it's a different type of, if we're going to use the word multiculturalism. I mean, what's interesting in the Quran, Allah Ta'ala says, I've created you different nations and cultures and languages so that you may know one another. So the Ottomans are very careful of making sure that people don't feel antagonized of their indigenous identities. So people may know one another, but they're not trying to mesh people in to try to make them uncomfortable, right? And then people understand human beings already know how to organize themselves within the milieux that they're in. And so the Ottomans don't have a need to regulate that. That is a responsibility of society. And this is what I mean in that sense, that sometimes we take away the agency of the Ummah itself of being able to regulate itself. The Ottomans allowed the Ummah to do that in that sense. And they had governors and so forth who would regulate in that nature. What they did is they oversaw that to make sure that moments of violence didn't take place, that the taxation was administered, that people's demands were met, and so forth. Fundamentally, what I've noticed in the Ottoman Empire, in the hierarchy of power, is they do have an essence of a duty of care over the people they're ruling over, both Muslim and non. And they do believe that authority and power should maintain that duty of care over the communities that they're ruling over. And they try to execute that to the best of their ability. They're not always successful. But what's interesting is the reason why this empire is surviving, even though there are contestations in Istanbul, is because fundamentally the empire is running itself.
What's about the European? I mean, obviously, Europe was at the very doorsteps of the Ottoman Empire. What was the dynamic that governed that kind of relationship? How did the Ottomans perceive the Europeans, and how did the Europeans perceive the Ottomans?
I think there was a level of mutual distrust, for sure. We have this idea, which is the irony, is the Russians called the Ottomans late on in the day, due to the Ottomans having difficulties economically, the sick man of Europe.
Yeah. Those were the Russians?
Those were the Russians.
Right.
Now, what's interesting is the Ottomans also called the British the sick man of India. The difference between the Ottomans and the British, perhaps, is, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but the British were at their highest point of empire in 1924 and then lost their empire in 48. So 22 years is gone. The Ottomans had made that claim 100 years before that. So they could see that this empire that's expanding excessively is still in trouble. And one of the things you look at when you look at power and empire in particular, perhaps, is it's not an issue of rise and decline, it's the issue of management is hard. And management of peoples requires, one, the ability to manage them, but two, about creating a perception of power. Once the perception of power is gone, then you're in trouble. What the British have done skillfully in regards to writing their own history as well is created an idea of a residual power. We still believe in Great Britain, the idea, because Britain is still here in that sense, whereas the Ottoman Empire doesn't exist anymore because we have the Turkish nation state in that sense. So we see it as a failure. But by calling them the sick man of Europe, there is a weird tacit acceptance that the Ottomans were European, right? In that sense, recognizing that they were a Muslim European power. And Walter Mignolo, who's a decolonial thinker, it's very rare to find any works on Ottoman history, but he makes one comment which I found interesting. He said the European empires had a problem with the Ottoman Empire. They didn't know how to place them. They couldn't place them with the rest of the Muslim world because they had colonized them. And they didn't want to include them in their concert of European powers because they were Muslim. So where do you put them? What's interesting about us as Muslims when we're doing history is we have squarely placed the Ottomans in the Muslim world as a declined entity because the Muslim world was. But it was fundamentally quite unique. It was still surviving in many ways. I always make the argument that the reasons why the Ottomans fundamentally failed near the end, just like how the British quickly collapsed, is poor policies near the end, in terms of poor leadership, poor policies, but also the inability to replicate forms of violence that the European powers were enacting. Islam would not allow that. And so when you're in a cage with an MMA fighter and he's juiced up on drugs and so forth, and you have to play by the rules, how do you do that? And it's taken us 100 years to figure out that, okay, that side is not playing by the rules, and we can see that in Gaza. Then what rules do you play by? What are your standards? What are your frameworks? Do you adhere to your own rules? Or do you try to make adjustments where you replicate those rules? I would say for 100 years what Muslims have done is they've replicated those forms of violence that were enacted on them, on their own peoples, in that sense, as a way of maintaining the status quo, perhaps. But what we should be asking ourselves is, one, what can we take from the Islamic historical past, including the Ottomans, of fashioning the possibility of saying we can be different, ethically, morally, politically, socially. And we should then show the examples of that. But then also saying, in these moments of extremities, what sort of standards are we going to represent? And do we have a framework that we sit by? But if we sit by that framework and it's leading to some level of defeat, what type of adjustment is the framework allowing us, perhaps? And that would encourage a particular form of creativity, perhaps, imagination, of saying, okay, is there a third space here? And this is how Islam continuously allows people to evolve over time, in that sense. What we're not doing either. We're kind of stuck. But I think it would have been unfair to assume that the Ottomans could have figured out 100 years ago how to match that type of violence. 100 years gone by, maybe we can. We've had that 100-year stretch of critiquing modernity, of critiquing colonialism, of critiquing the violence, of critiquing the hegemony and so forth, and then saying, okay, at the moment what I've noticed is we are very good at critique culture, but we're not solution-driven yet. To be solution-driven, you have to be dawah-orientated. And even in our minds, dawah is YouTube and sitting at a table. But it's not civilizational dawah to humanity, which is usually done by power, which is absent in our case, right? So my argument is, I guess, is that having that 100-year moment is maybe a rahmah from Allah Ta'ala. It's given us some time to look back, which is something the Ottomans probably wouldn't have been able to anticipate. It was too close to home. It was too close for comfort. It was happening too quickly for them to make sense of, can we be a colonial power or not? And I don't think Islam would have allowed them to be a colonial power. They exercised it once during the time of Mahmud II, which is they tried to centralize their state, and he used extreme measures because society was not adhering to his warnings in regards to the Russian and European encroachment. Heavy taxation policies, forced military conscription, confiscation of waqfs, confiscations of land. He succeeded in centralizing the empire, but in the end, Mehmed Ali Pasha moved against him, right? And there was then this internal contestation, which then allowed the European powers to get involved again. So it's clear that they didn't know how to deal with this new type of violence.
It's interesting how you describe how the West, Europe particularly, how it perceived the Ottomans. And in a way, that still stands.
Absolutely.
I mean, much of that still stands.
Absolutely. Because they write the history. That's the issue here. If you go, so after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, or even during the end moment of the Ottoman Empire, you see the emergence of two disciplines in Western universities, Islamic studies and Ottoman studies. We don't see that in our seminaries. That doesn't. Now, Islamic studies make sense. We don't have that because we have Ulumuddin, we have the ulama, we're studying in the madrasas and so forth. But where did Ottoman studies come from? And that's a purely Western construct. It's a Western endeavor to understand the Ottoman past. And fundamentally, you'll see that the scholarship is coming out of America, Europe, the State of Israel, and Japan. And these are all considered themselves as a circle of being Western, perhaps. That was intriguing about the Israelis, and they're very unique in this sense, is that they're the state that doesn't have an Ottoman past. Yet they write extensively about the Ottoman Empire. Right? They have this sort of intellectual sort of like agency over, or inclusion perhaps, in the discussion about the Ottomans, in a way that Muslims don't, because we don't study it. And, you know, there's only a few universities like in Cairo and the AUB, perhaps, that do this, and then Turkey, for sure. But in Turkey, it's very Turco-centered. in that sense. And so Muslims around the world haven't been able to grapple with, one, the loss, but two, the imagination and the memory. And that's dangerous. So like, I always use the Israelis as an example. They took away Palestinian land. They took away Palestinian lives. They took away, though, the Palestinian memories and the Palestinian imaginations, right? And that's dangerous because when you take away the memories of what you were prior to the Israeli occupation, what you were before the mandate, and how were you configured as people, and not allowing your intelligentsia to be able to write about that, especially Muslims, is problematic. And then not giving the people the permission to even think of an imagination outside of the solutions that you're giving them. And that is also problematic. So then you get stuck. And here what you see in the West is their ability to do Ottoman studies. And our unwillingness to engage in it, perhaps, is then created this deficiency in the community, whereas giving them a particular level of agency over us, about schooling us, about what is right and what is wrong. That can't continue. And people can have all sorts of opinions about how they feel about the Ottomans. You know, I come on many podcasts and I get people attacking me all the time, assuming I'm an apologist for the Ottomans. See, I'm not. I'm just a historian. What I'm doing is trying to explain, but however, that it's 600-year history, that whole is not helpful. And the idea that we're just going to study about how bad the Ottomans were and not looking at the bigger painting and just focus on the brushstrokes, I think that's a concern for me. Like, we have to own it, good and bad. 600 years of Muslims as an empire. We have to own it. And somebody told me once, like, you know, you should write about Muslims in Europe as a minority. We really need to do that. And I said, I'm writing about Muslims who are a minority. I said, the Ottoman Empire, they were a minority, actually. Non-Muslims were the majority in the Ottoman Empire. And it's interesting to show how Muslims as a minority were governing with Islam over non-Muslims who were the majority. And yes, okay, non-Muslims made up a tapestry of different types of configurations and so forth, but that's important. And how the Ottomans were careful, perhaps, of making sure that they didn't agitate non-Muslims who were living in the domains. And I think that's important. And India was the same. When you look at India, the Mughals were a minority in that sense. The Hindus were always a majority in that sense. So what you learn then is Islam has a particular level of benevolence that it can show to humanity, where humanity can still survive on its own terms. Today, the way that the current structures work, it doesn't permit that. And this is where I think the fact that we're not studying this history in of itself is detrimental to us, just like I would argue, actually, not knowing about Andalusia. Yeah. It's a problem.
Obviously unfortunately, most of what we know about the Ottoman Empire came through the Western lens.
Absolutely.
And through Western commentary. Mm-hmm. Obviously, one of the things that continuously comes up is the fact that the Ottomans, towards their end, backed Germany in the First World War and stood by Hitler. And that's always used to describe the Ottomans as though they were Nazi sympathizers and the such, when we know that within the realm of the Ottoman Empire, there were countless Jewish communities living, thriving, in quite, good conditions, whilst their brothers were being persecuted to no end in Europe, throughout Europe. What's the reality of that? Why did that come about?
Well, the Ottomans firstly don't align with the Germans during the period of Nazi Germany. This Nazi emergence. That's a phenomenon of World War II. The Ottomans collapsed in World War I. And the German, the sort of like Prussia, as they call it at the time, that was a very different type of state. Now, the Ottomans in World War I are in a bit of a quagmire because one of the things that they have as a problem is it's a new reality of alliances and political alliances. And the British have become exceptional at creating alliances, or even their competitors like the French and the Russians and the Americans, perhaps. And the Ottomans, the Muslim world is colonized. So it's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, which is like, how are we going to out-survive these alliances that are being created in the West by these colonial powers? And so when World War I happens, for the Ottomans, it has to be remembered that the Ottomans, World War I happens for them in 1911 when the Italians invaded Libya. And then you have the Balkan Wars in 1912, 1913, and then you have 1914. So the Ottomans are already in this situation, and Iran is stuck in a situation where the Russians and the British have invaded. So the Muslim world is already in this particular position, right? And we always look at history from the perspective of the British in 1914. Now, what the Ottomans are trying to do in 1911 already is trying to say, okay, if we align ourselves with the British, nominally this will buy us some time. The British said no. The French said no. And the concern the Ottomans had was the Russians, which is the Russian encroachment. The Germans were perceived as a rising power. The Germans were very successful in what they were achieving, and the Germans made particular concessions to the Ottomans. Now, did any of them imagine the way World War I would pan out? No, I don't think so. And this is an interesting moment in history, which is World War I. Is it a contingency moment? Is it a moment that no one could have imagined, just like October the 7th? Or is it something that could have been predicted? Because as historians, this is what we try to do, right? And I would argue that World War I was a contingency moment. It was a moment where I don't think anyone anticipated the sort of like rollout of what was going to take place. Now, the reason why the Ottomans fell in World War I, there are many reasons, but the three main reasons are incompetency in leadership, not having...
Political or military leadership?
Both. But the political leaders are military leaders in that sense. Secondly, the inability to have the human resources to compete on that front. People forget that the population of the Ottoman Empire maximum is 30 million people, right? They don't have an infinite tap of human beings they can fight on the front, whereas the British are pulling people from India, from Australia, the French are going to Algeria and so forth. So they don't have that sort of human manpower to be able to compete on that front. And finally, I think the problem is that military tech. When people complain about the Ottomans regarding printing press and so forth, this is not the issue. The main issue the Ottomans are struggling with is military technology. And military technology emerges with what we call the paradox of war. The more you're in war, the more better you become at it. And it's a risky strategy of continuously being in a state of warfare, because warfare is dangerous and it can lead to the collapse of your state. But being in a state of war, you'll continuously have the ability to test out new weaponry and create new weaponry as the conditions are changing. The Ottomans were for a long time in a state of peace. And looking at the Europeans taking chunks out of each other during the Napoleonic Wars and saying, alhamdulillah, we're not like those people. But those wars which the Europeans went through gave them an edge over the Ottomans, because they started creating new forms of technologies which the Ottomans had never seen before, and the types of colonialism and looting that came with it that provided them the possibility of creating these new types of tech is what made it hard for them. So then you ask yourself, okay, like how do you make sense of all these pieces? And there's only so much you can control in that sense. And maybe fundamentally Allah Ta'ala just wanted that empire to end.
I'm interested because I mean, obviously the straw that broke the camel's back was what is termed, falsely in my estimation, the Grand Revolution, the Arab Grand Revolution. I'm interested in what preceded that. Obviously, we know bits and pieces of how the Brits, through Lawrence and others, how they played Arabs who were after some mirage of a project of independence and as such. But I'm pretty sure that there were conditions that allowed the Arabs to buy into that lie. And I'm interested in those conditions. Now, in my very, very rudimentary research, I get the idea that as of 1880 and the such, things started to be on the downward. And that led to that decentralized form of government being making people more desperate, more separate from the center, as well as probably some mismanagement of sorts and the like, that had the Arabs feel that they were being marginalized, that they were being oppressed, that they were being so and so and so. In the lead up to the Grand Arab Revolution, what was happening within the Ottoman Empire?
I think one of the things I've learned as a historian is to try to put a moment and say this was the moment where things went wrong. Because life is so fluid. We really don't know where that turning moment was. But what I can say is that clearly there are some issues on both sides. For me, there is a frustration in the Arab world regarding certain ways and certain politics of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. That is clear, because you see the emergence of the sort of like reformist Salafist movement, which didn't exist before. And this is a movement that emerges as a response to not only the European sort of like Enlightenment ideologies that come about in the Muslim world, but also a particular sort of like a conservative form of politics that Abdul Hamid practices. And so you can clearly see that there's a particular type of frustration that's emerging. It's not just the sort of reformist Salafis. You see the emergence of the Wahhabi movement in the Hijaz that comes about in that sense. And in Sudan, you see the Mahdist movement and so forth. So one of the interesting things is the 19th century is, now this is where the printing press is interesting, is the creation of steam technology, which allows the movements of people, movements of ideas. And it's created a new type of momentum of critique culture, which sort of like synergizes itself. And when one group of people can resonate with another group of people who complain about the same thing, it creates a particular perception, perhaps, that they are being mistreated by the center. Now, the center's inability to deal with that threat, because they saw it as a threat rather than seeing it as, okay, this is the conditions of the reality of the time. I mean, the Ottomans were doing exactly the same in Anatolia and the Balkans, actually, right? And that's in terms of trying to close this down. But by the time the Young Turks come to power, they also reflect that frustration. This is why they come to power. They come into...
This is around what time?
1908, right? So you have the Young Turk Revolution, they call it, and they call for the constitution. Now, what's interesting is, might resonate with some people today, is the Young Turks were not charismatic or ideological enough to say what they wanted, although they said they want the constitution. They made the argument of what they didn't want, right? And but they managed to come into power slowly, perhaps, and influence the state structure. And the problem with revolutions is revolutionary activity, on the one hand, permits you that reset moment, but it really destabilizes the whole infrastructure. And they created a space, perhaps, and they did it understandably because they were concerned that the status quo is not working. We're sitting idle here and, you know, they're chipping away at us slowly, similar to what the Hamas felt on October 7th. They're chipping away. We're going to have to make a preemptive move, otherwise we're in trouble here. So Young Turks make a preemptive move, and they take a risk and a gamble, and they're able to remove Sultan Abdul Hamid from power. So they were part of that general culture of agitation, because Abdul Hamid's been in power for 33 years. That's a long amount of time, right? Now, for all the success of Abdul Hamid in terms of what he achieved regarding Islam and the state, but nonetheless, there are also always going to be human beings who are going to take exception to a particular style of politics. When the Young Turks come into power, however, their belief is that we now need to purge people who are Hamidian loyalists, including the Arab provinces, and replace them with people who are more in line with what we believe in. And then they posit forward the possibility of creating a new type of centralized state administration in which Turkish is important. And Arab elites started to fear that, thinking this is an attempt to try to create a culture of assimilation. Now, it might not have been true. It might have been a perception, perhaps, but that perception stuck, and it was in the minds of people. Now, what the Young Turks did, however, is they doubled down on their policies in the Arab provinces, which exacerbated the tension. And they were unable to quell that tension. They'd come into power by 1909, and by 1914, we've got a war. So they haven't had the amount of time to be in power long enough to understand in the machinery that the way that they're doing their sort of like very young type of politics is not conducive to how the region feels. And so when World War I happens, I would argue that even in the case of Sharif Hussein, he wasn't totally all-out anti-Ottoman. What he was looking at was, okay, this is the order of the day. The empire's tanking, and I need to do something to safeguard myself. The Ottomans saw that as a sign of treachery, and so now you've got tensions on both sides, and the inability to try to come to the table and say, okay, hang on a minute, the stakes are very high here.
Whilst at the same time, the Brits are doing that.
Absolutely.
thing.
And then you've got a war going on. And so the type of decision-making that needs to be made in that sort of extremity, in that moment, you can clearly see that Muslims are are sort of making horrible choices here. So I'm willing to entertain the idea that it wasn't just simply a form of, the Arabs, and it's a group of Arabs, by the way, because there are a lot of Arabs who are fighting on the side of the Ottomans in World War I, which is well known in that sense. But it's a particular group who have aligned themselves and hedged their bets with the British in the hope that they would have a decentralized world in which the Ottoman state might survive, but they would have some level of autonomy. And they've seen that happen in Lebanon, in Tunisia, and so forth. So they possibly thought, okay, maybe it might be a little bit different. They miscalculated, and obviously, clearly, they were unaware of Sykes and Picot. So, I mean, they should have known what the British were about, and Istanbul knew that. But Istanbul's sort of like military treatment of the Arabs in Bilad al-Sham in particular was exceptionally harsh, and it had the adverse effect. And then that's what you learn afterwards, that a lot of these states, when they were created by military men who lacked that diplomacy, perhaps, of how to usher and go through these rocky moments. And so across the board, there seems to be, I think, a monumental failure of leadership, perhaps.
Those claims that the Kurds were sort of maligned and the Arabs were looked upon in racist terms, and others were sort of denigrated and the like. Is there any credence to that?
I think there is enough to make the case that there was a particular level of elitism amongst the people of power who were administering the state in post-Abd al-Hamid. They don't only use that type of language towards the Arabs and the Kurds, they use it against the Turks too. And there's sort of like class structure,
What
perhaps.
brought this about?
I think to some degree there is a requirement or a need to put the peasantry into the military forces in that sense. And then clearly a group of people who are educated in a particular way in comparison to the person who's from the farm, and you can clearly see a distinction.
Is it also because the empire became embattled, there were economic pressures and the like? And
it's difficult to know. I mean, what I am reluctant to say is that there was a particular form of nationalism already emerging. I don't see the evidence for that. Or I see a reflection of a culture of Arabism, which is a particular like autonomy in the Arab world of being proud of the Arabic language, Arabic literature, Arabic customs, and so forth, and feeling a threat from Istanbul of saying you're going to agitate that. But I didn't see any information from Muslims, anyway, of making the case that they want independent Arab states. I mean, because fundamentally, those states were created by Sykes and Picot. So that wasn't the call there. We can see that with the Albanians as well, and we can see that in Turkey. So Muslims didn't have that part of their imagination. What they may have had is the belief that, they can get some space from Istanbul. And yeah, I am willing to concede that the sort of like new generation of educated class look down on others and otherize them to some degree in a way which we can clearly say is derogatory for sure. But if someone wants to make the case that is racist language, it's fine. But my argument is they were using it across the board. So it's something more classist in that sense, because they didn't absolve the Turks from that type of language.
Recently I came across the story of the Crescent and Stars on the Irish flag.
Yeah.
And the story of that time when the Irish were suffering an incredible famine.
Absolutely.
And the only state to actually provide assistance despite the position of the Queen was Turkey.
Absolutely.
And for that, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Sultan Abdul Majid himself, and this is interesting because some people will make the argument that he was doing realpolitik and so forth. But actually, when you look closer into the Ottoman intentions, and you can see these sentiments that exist in Abdul Majid, Abdul Aziz, and Sultan Abdul Hamid, that they really do genuinely care about peoples that were struggling and suffering. And they did what they could in regards to supporting the Irish in terms of the type of suffering that they were going through. And I think any Muslim understands that, actually. Any Muslim today, we are the most generous of people when it comes to charity.
The thing is, we understand it as people, we don't understand it as governments
Absolutely.
or authorities.
Absolutely.
That's where it becomes a little bit confusing.
Right, and the thing is that there's an assumption that the Ottomans did it because they wanted something back in return.
Because that's how politics
That's how
works.
politics is. But here, there was nothing back in return. It was just simply that, okay, there's a situation here. We have particular set of resources we can send to these people, and we can help them out, and we can move on. And people forget that the Ottoman Empire at that time is an empire where large swaths of migrants are coming to the Ottoman Empire for various reasons.
Where from?
Parts of the Russian world and so forth. So the Ottoman state is unique in the sense, and Istanbul is known for being a state which is accustomed to migration coming from war-torn areas, perhaps. And there's a lot of movement taking place in that sense. So the Ottomans have a sensitivity. Like, for example, a lot of the Muslims that came from the Russian states in regards to the migration went into the Ottoman, those who were skilled, went into the Ottoman administration very quickly. So the Ottomans didn't marginalize them by saying, well, you're not part of this state. They put them in the machinery and said, we can make use of you, and you're Muslim, and how can this work? Today's nation state wouldn't do that. America does that. And this is what's interesting about America, where you can meet a guy from Pakistan who's proud to be Pakistani, travel to America, and then say, I'm American. Whereas if this Pakistani guy came to Turkey, he's never going to say, I'm a Turk. So you see something about the nature of America in some ways. It's empire. It operates as empire. It's an ideological empire as well. It's an idea state. And it allows and it permits people the space to come in and loosely be defined by people that live there, by their principles and values and so forth. In that sense, the Ottomans were very similar, right? It's a state which allows people to come in. It's not a strong identity like nationalism. So when the collapse of the Ottoman Empire happens, people are not going, we're Ottomans, what happened? Because they didn't define people in that way. Fundamentally, people define themselves on religion and locality. I'm from Mardin, I'm from Istanbul, I'm from Baghdad. And that's how they operated. And that sort of like localization of identity beyond nationalism, it sort of created the possibility of restricting the type of otherization that the nation state has put forward.
Clearly, you absolutely align the Ottomans with Islam.
Yes.
Is that throughout?
Yes.
Throughout?
Yes.
And Islam was what to let's say, the various eras that the Ottoman Empire went through? We're talking about 600 years, by the way. I mean, that's an incredibly expansive amount of time, and things might have happened, and developments and wars and struggles and all of that. And yet, you're saying that throughout that time, Islam was at the very heart of rule.
Absolutely.
Was there no time when someone came and sort of said, okay, so Islam is something I refer to when I want, but I'm going to do things differently?
The individual might do that, but the canopy is still Islam. You can't move out from the machinery. This is the thing here, which is that when the canopy... So the Ottomans have this concept called Dinu Devlet. So Din is Islam, and Devlet is the state. Not the state that we have today, but it means governance. And people, they mistakenly, when they say Din, and then there's a U, which means and then Devlet, they think that these are two separate things, but it's actually Dinu Devlet. They're inseparable. The way that I explain it to my students so that they can understand sometimes is you say Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. They're distinctively different, but inseparable. So in the case of the Ottomans, they had already popularized the idea of Dinu Devlet. Now, Din can survive without Devlet, but Din's optimum execution requires a Devlet, whereas Devlet without Din is not an Islamic Devlet. It's just a state. And the Ottomans would never have imagined their states and their principalities and their politics to be without Islam. And even the early Ottomans, so like Osman Ghazi, Orhan Ghazi, and there have been sometimes arguments that they were probably not religious Muslims and so forth. And we see works by people like Abdurrahman Achil and so forth who make the case that in the Ottoman case, the early Ottomans, the uniqueness about the early Ottomans is that ulama were part of the state building process. That doesn't happen in the Umayyad and the Abbasids because the ulama are already there. They emerge as a class. But after the Mongol invasion, when new Turkic principalities are emerging and creating their states, the ulama are part of these configurations and are guiding the rulership to some degree to create the states. If we just look at the leadership, then we will assume that this person's has absolute power and has the capacity and the ability to do as they please. But if you look at it as a confederation of different entities, and once again I said Khilafah as a metaphor, ulama and ummah, you look at it and the ummah are made up of soldiers and guildsmen and so forth, and the ulama are made up of muftis and qadis and teachers, and the Khilafah is made up of the walis, the governors and so forth. As a complex matrix perhaps, it's impossible for a ruler to go outside of Islam unless if he had an exceptional centralized state in the way that we have the nation state today. They didn't have that type of configuration, so it was impossible for them to do that. Now, there were certain rulers who did extremities, and there would have been times where those sort of like institutions of power may have stayed silent out of fear and so forth. But the minute that person died, it went back to the center. They pulled it back in that sense, right? So when we see the extreme case of the extreme fratricide, where so many sons were killed, even babies, fratricide was abolished the minute that sultan was gone. Never again. It shocked the community to a degree that they said, this cannot happen ever again, in that sense. So you can see that, okay, there could have been a particular ruler who had a particular tendency of a particular type of authority. But the canopy, by and large, is one which is independent. And this is what's interesting here, that when we say Shahada and we say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadin abduhu, that means that even Rasul Sallam is now, he doesn't control Islam here. It's Allah Ta'ala who's in charge here, and that he submits to it. And that component of abduhu is something that people ask me all the time regarding the ulama. I said the ulama do not have the capacity to control Islam because of the plurality within the ulama. That if one alim went off, there will be another group who will hold him back to account. And that's the beauty of Islam, in that sense, that there's a mechanism and a machinery that makes sure that we can't go off center. And even today, that's the case, right? That's why we're still here. So in the Ottoman case, I would confidently say that they were Muslims, Sunni Muslims throughout. And now that would have evolved as time went on. And this is one of the interesting things about Islam and Sunni Islam and even Madhab Hanafi to some degree, is the ability to continuously reinvent itself as time is changing, right? And that's the key thing here, that notion of tajdeed, which is continuously happening as the world is moving along, is something that maybe we don't pay much attention to as Muslims. And one could argue today that is there a need for a tajdeed moment in that sense? But that requires a particular level of diagnosis of where we're at, and then say, okay. And that requires another level of diagnosis by saying we have something to offer. So that's where the Ottomans become interesting, maybe.
Jazakallahu khair.
Barakallahu feek.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.